My name is Vanessa Carter. I am an admiral in the United States Navy, the youngest in my command. I have walked through war zones, commanded fleets, and made decisions that changed lives in seconds. But on the day of my wedding, the only thing in my hand was my phone, and the message from my father that said, "Don't come to the wedding. You're a disgrace to this family." It did not make my heart race. It did not bring tears to my eyes. It pulled me back through every moment he told me I did not belong in a uniform. Every time he said the Navy was for men, not for his daughter. And as the doors of the Naval Chapel opened and a four-star general turned to call my name, I knew something my father never had the courage to see. Respect is earned, and I had earned every single salute waiting for me inside. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments so I know how far this story reaches. And if you are new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you will never miss the next story. The air inside the Naval Chapel carried a stillness that was both heavy and sacred, like the moment before a storm breaks. The scent of polished oak and brass mingled with the faint salt in the breeze drifting through the half-open side doors. Stained glass windows threw fractured beams of light across the pews, painting stripes of red, blue, and gold over the dress uniforms in the room. My boots were steady on the marble floor, each step a measured beat against the quiet hum of whispers. Rows of sailors, Marines, and a few officers from other branches filled the front pews. Some sat with backs straight, hands folded neatly on their laps. Others stood at ease along the side aisles, the gold of their buttons catching the light. I recognized faces from missions years past, men and women who had fought beside me in sandstorms, who had dragged me out of fire, who had seen me bleed. At the far end of the aisle, the altar stood simple but deliberate. No towering arrangements, no lavish decor, just the clean lines of the naval crest and the faint glint of the ceremonial swords that would form the arch when we left. This was not a place built for show. It was built for oath-taking, for moments where words bound people tighter than chains. I stayed just inside the doorway, my gloved hands adjusting the brim of my cap. Chief Hill, standing to my left, gave a small nod, the kind of nod that carried the weight of every shared operation we'd survived. On my right, Senior Chief Torres shifted his prosthetic leg, the faint click of the joint lost under the distant murmur of the crowd. These men weren't groomsmen. They were my shield, my history, my proof that I had walked through fire and come out steel. Every eye in the room had shifted the moment the doors cracked open. I could feel it. A tangible current pulling toward me, some gazes warm with recognition, others sharp with curiosity. But behind those stares, there was something else. Questions. Questions about how a woman, the daughter of Colonel Richard Carter, had risen to wear 4 stars on her shoulder. Questions about whether the stories they'd heard were truth or legend. The sunlight through the stained glass caught on the silver bars of my medals, sending shards of brightness dancing across the aisle. I had worn these in war zones, in strategy rooms, in ceremonies for fallen friends. Today, I wore them for love, but also as a reminder, to myself and to anyone watching, that every thread in this uniform had been earned. In that breath before I stepped forward, I thought about the weight of the message in my pocket. The words weren't new. I had carried them in different forms for most of my life. But standing here, in front of a room full of people who had chosen to be here, I realized something sharp and liberating. Shame only works if you agree with it. And I didn't. Not anymore. I was born into a house where the sound of boots on tile was our morning alarm, and the smell of black coffee strong enough to peel paint was the background to every breakfast. My father, Colonel Richard Carter, was the kind of man whose silence cut sharper than most men's shouting. 3 tours in the Army, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, a jaw that never seemed to unclench, eyes like cold steel behind a pressed uniform. The walls of our home were lined with photographs of him standing stiff-backed, shoulders squared, medals arranged in perfect order across his chest. In the study, those same medals sat under glass, each one aligned as precisely as if they were still on inspection. As a child, I would stand in the doorway, drawn to the shimmer of gold and silver, too afraid to get closer. Once curiosity got the better of me. I reached for a ribbon, tracing the edge with one finger. Without looking up from his paperwork, my father caught my wrist and said in that flat, final tone, "The uniform is for men. Don't play dress up." My mother, Margaret Carter, was the counterweight to his rigidity. A high school literature teacher, she carried the faint scent of lavender and the softness of someone who saw past the walls people built. She read me poetry at bedtime, her voice wrapping around words like a lullaby. And when my father wasn't in the room, she would lean in and whisper, "You're stronger than you know, Vanessa. Stronger than he'll ever admit." She called me her storm. Wild, fierce, a little too strong for my own good. But my father's opinion of me wasn't just cold, it was calculated. He believed roles were fixed. Men fought, women supported, and his daughter would not, under any circumstances, wear the colors of a fighting force. When I was 10, he took me to an Army-Navy game at the stadium. The crowd roared, the bands played, midshipmen and cadets in gleaming dress uniforms filled the stands like a living mosaic of discipline and pride. I thought it was magic. He leaned down, his voice as matter-of-fact as if he were telling me tomorrow's weather, and said, "You'll never wear those colors. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." It wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. And I carried it like a stone in my chest for years. Even small victories at home were measured against an invisible scale I could never balance. Win a science fair? Good. But don't get distracted from learning something useful. Make the varsity swim team? Swimming won't keep a roof over your head. Every achievement was filed away as temporary, not part of the real measure of a Carter. The real measure in his eyes was military service. And yet the irony burned. I wanted it more than anything. Not because I needed his approval, though when I was younger, I told myself that was the reason. I wanted it because the uniform meant challenge, meant discipline, meant standing for something bigger than yourself. I wanted it because deep down, I knew I could do it. My mother saw that in me, even if he refused to. When she graded papers at the kitchen table, she'd slide a sticky note across to me with lines from poems she thought I needed. One read, "Storms aren't meant to stay grounded. Let the wind harden you, not break you." Looking back now, I think she was planting seeds for the day I would decide to go after what I wanted, no matter how high the walls my father built. She knew the storm would rise. She was just making sure I was ready to steer it. There are moments from childhood that blur with time, edges softened by years. But the ones where you're made to feel small, they stay sharp, no matter how much you grow. I remember one Saturday afternoon when I was 7. My father had just returned from a deployment. The living room smelled faintly of dust and starch from his pressed uniform. I sat cross-legged on the carpet, playing with a plastic model ship I'd gotten from a flea market. I'd spent hours piecing it together, imagining it slicing through waves under a blazing sun. When he walked in, I held it up, proud, and said, "One day I'll sail on a real one." He didn't even glance at it. Instead, he pulled off his gloves, tossed them onto the chair, and said, "Ships are for sailors. And sailors are men. Put that away." His words didn't come with a raised voice. They didn't need to. The cold dismissal was enough to send heat to my cheeks. At 10, the Army-Navy game became another scar. I'd been so excited, clutching the ticket in my mittened hand, eyes wide at the sight of the marching bands and precision drills. When the midshipmen in their immaculate whites passed by, I stood on my toes, waving like they could see me. My father leaned down and said, "Don't fool yourself, Vanessa. You'll never wear those colors. They demand more than you can give." I didn't argue. I just swallowed the words and let them settle like stones at the bottom of my chest. The worst came at 13. I'd worked for months on a school project about women in military history. Admiral Grace Hopper, General Anne Dunwoody, pioneers who had broken through ceilings of steel and expectation. I stood in the dining room, poster board in hand, ready to show him. He didn't even sit down. He glanced once and said, You're wasting your time looking up to people who only got where they did because the standards were lowered. My mother tried to intervene, but he'd already turned and left the room. That night, I slid the poster under my bed and didn't take it out again until years later, when I was packing for Annapolis. By the time I was 16, I had learned to stop looking to him for encouragement. My victories were celebrated in silence, or more often with a quiet nod from my mother. I started pushing harder in school, not to win his approval, but to prepare myself for the day I could prove him wrong. Every time I swam an extra lap, ran an extra mile, or studied an extra hour, I imagined the look on his face when I stood in a uniform he said I'd never wear. There was one night that cemented it for me. I'd stayed up late, finishing an essay for my application to the Naval Academy. I didn't hear him come into the kitchen until he was standing behind me. Without a word, he set a manila envelope on the table. Inside were applications for law school, nursing programs, and teaching credentials. Not a single one had an anchor on the seal. "Pick one," he said. "Something respectable, something safe." I didn't answer. I just kept writing. He left the envelope there, a silent command I refused to obey. Later, when the house was asleep, I folded my completed Naval Academy application, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it shut. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from something harder to name. Resolve. I think, in his mind, my silence that night meant surrender. But it was the opposite. It was the moment I decided I would not let his voice define my future. The day the acceptance letter arrived, the world outside felt brighter, sharper, as if even the air knew what was in that envelope. I remember running up the walkway, the corner of the letter crumpled where I'd gripped it too tightly. My heart pounded, not from the sprint, but from the weight of what I was holding. My mother was in the kitchen, her cardigan sleeves pushed up, hands deep in a mixing bowl. She turned when she saw me, flour dusting her cheek. "Is that?" she asked, her voice catching on the edge of hope. I nodded, breathless, and handed it to her first. She read the words silently, her eyes shining before passing it back. "You did it, Vanessa," she whispered, squeezing my hand. When my father walked in a few minutes later, I was still holding the letter, my fingers leaving faint creases in the paper. I held it out to him, expecting, just for a second, that maybe this time would be different. That maybe he would read the words and see what I had fought for. He didn't take it. Instead, he placed a manila folder on the table in front of me. Inside were more respectable options: scholarships for law, nursing, education. Programs he'd already researched, deadlines highlighted in neat red ink. "These are solid paths," he said. "Pick one. Don't throw your future away on a fantasy." It was the same tone he'd used my whole life when he wanted a conversation to end before it began. But something in me had shifted. I didn't argue, didn't plead. I just folded the acceptance letter, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it into my bag. That night, I sat at my desk with the commitment papers spread out in front of me. My pen hovered for a moment, the silence of the house pressing in around me. I could hear my father's steady footsteps in the hallway, the muted hum of the television in the living room. I thought about every time he'd said I couldn't, every time he'd cut down the dream before it could take root. Then I signed my name. The summer before Annapolis felt like moving through a storm no one else could see. My father didn't speak to me, not at breakfast, not at dinner, not even when we passed in the hallway. Conversations went through my mother, her voice careful, as if speaking too loudly might make the walls close in. On my birthday, she sang alone over a plate of pancakes, the candles flickering in the quiet. Packing for the academy was an exercise in defiance. I folded plain white t-shirts, pressed slacks, and the few personal items I was allowed into a regulation duffel. My mother slipped the old poster board of women in military history into the side pocket, its edges frayed but the faces still fierce. "For your room," she said with a small smile, "in case you need reminding." The day I left, my father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I paused, waiting for something. A word, a nod, anything. but he simply stepped aside, letting me pass without a sound. As the bus pulled away, I looked back once. He was still standing there, a shadow in the frame of the door. I didn't wave. Neither did he. Annapolis in the summer was heat and discipline woven into every second. Sweat rolled down my neck during the first plebe formation, the starched fabric of my uniform clinging to my skin. Drill instructors paced with eyes like hawks, searching for weakness. I had learned to stand still years before in my father's living room, so I didn't flinch when their shadows crossed my boots. From the very first day, I knew this wasn't just about becoming an officer. It was about proving to myself that I could carry the weight of those colors, and that no one, not even my father, could tell me otherwise. Annapolis had a way of stripping you bare. Not just your comfort, but every assumption you had about yourself. The first week alone felt like being dropped into the middle of a storm without a compass. From dawn until well past dark, it was a relentless grind. Physical training, drills, inspections, classes that demanded you memorize entire manuals overnight. For most plebes, the pressure came from the sheer volume of expectations. For me, it was doubled. I was not just a new cadet. I was a woman in a place that still measured worth in the number of men who'd worn the uniform before you. Some of the upperclassmen didn't bother hiding it. When we lined up for the obstacle course, I caught the smirk of one midshipman who leaned to his friend and said, "Watch her fail the wall. It's too high for someone like her." I didn't fail. I cleared it on the first try. But instead of acknowledging it, they whispered something about lucky footing and walked away. That was the pattern. Do the work, exceed the standard, and still be met with quiet dismissal. The inspections were worse. Beds so tight you could bounce a coin on them, boots polished to a mirror finish, uniforms pressed until there wasn't a single wrinkle. I poured every ounce of focus into getting them perfect. But more than once, my scores came back lower than I knew they should have been. At first, I thought it was just me missing small details under pressure. Then one night, I overheard two classmates talking in the common room. "She had a perfect rack this morning," one said. "Yeah, but Lieutenant Keating doesn't want her on the command track. Says she's better off in support." Lieutenant Keating was one of our training officers. He never said anything to me directly, but I started noticing the pattern. Small deductions for things no one else got marked down for. Subtle comments about how some cadets are better suited for administrative roles. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one designed to keep me just below the line I'd need to cross for early leadership positions. The breaking point came during a midterm field exercise. We'd been given a mock mission: establish a secure base camp, coordinate supply routes, and run reconnaissance. Each team had a leader, and I'd been assigned the role after scoring highest in the planning phase. But when the scores came back, my leadership rating had mysteriously dropped from excellent to satisfactory. It didn't make sense. Our camp had been the most secure. We'd completed the objectives faster than any other group. And yet, my evaluation sheet, signed by Keating, listed lack of decisive communication as the reason for the lower score. I could have swallowed it. Plenty of cadets did. Complaints against instructors had a way of vanishing into thin air, and making noise could easily mark you as difficult to work with. But I remembered the envelope my father had left on the kitchen table, filled with careers he thought I was fit for. I remembered how he had never believed I could belong here. So, I started collecting proof. Quietly. I borrowed a small camera from a classmate in the photography club, telling him I wanted to document a day in the life for a project. I recorded our next inspection. Every bed, every boot, every locker. When the scores came back, my deductions were identical to before, even when my work matched cadets who had scored higher. I logged each discrepancy, each note on my performance review that didn't match the actual results. 2 weeks later, I requested a private meeting with the commandant. I walked in with a binder. Photos, logs, side-by-side comparisons of my work and that of my peers. I didn't make accusations. I presented the facts. Keating was reassigned by the end of the week. No one told me why, and no one congratulated me. But from that point on, my scores reflected the work I put in. And the whispers? They didn't stop. They just changed. She's not just tough, she's dangerous. I overheard one cadet mutter. They meant it as a warning. I took it as a compliment. By the time I graduated from Annapolis, I had learned two unshakable truths. First, no one was going to hand me respect. I had to take it, inch by inch. Second, the battlefield didn't care who you were. It cared if you could deliver. My first real test came in Okinawa. I'd been assigned to a logistics unit, far from the glamorous front lines, but critical all the same. Our job was to make sure supplies got where they needed to go, when they needed to be there, without fail. It wasn't just moving boxes, it was moving lifelines. Ammunition, medical gear, food, clean water. Any delay could cost lives. One humid morning, the call came in. A small supply team had been ambushed during a recon run off the Somali coast. 2 men were injured, one badly. The standard protocol for someone in my position, a newly minted lieutenant commander, was to coordinate the rescue from the base. Stay put. Send others. But sitting behind a desk while my people bled in the dirt? That wasn't in me. I geared up and went with the response team. We landed on a strip of rusted corrugated metal that served as a makeshift dock. Gunfire cracked in the distance, sharp and irregular. The air smelled of salt, oil, and smoke. We crawled behind a stack of shipping containers, the heat pressing in from every side. That's when I saw him. Petty Officer Jared Lang, one of our youngest, lying flat on the ground, leg mangled below the knee, blood soaking the sand beneath him. He was still conscious, barely, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Stay with me, Lang," I told him, dropping to my knees. My training kicked in before fear had a chance to register. I cinched a tourniquet high on his thigh, keeping pressure on the femoral artery with one hand while calling for medevac with the other. Bullets hit the container above us, showering rust flakes into my hair. Someone shouted for me to take cover, but I wasn't leaving him. We held that position for what felt like an eternity before the chopper finally arrived. By the time we got Lang on board, shrapnel had sliced through my side. The medic tried to push me onto a stretcher, but I shook my head. Save it for someone who needs it. The mission didn't make headlines. There were no photographers, no press briefings, but Lang lived. Months later, I got a Christmas card from him with a photo of his newborn daughter, Avery. He wrote, "She wouldn't be here without you." That meant more than any medal could. But not everyone saw it that way. When we got back, the after-action report credited the rescue to my immediate superior, Commander Philip Rourke. He hadn't left the base that day. In his version, I was part of the coordination effort, but not on the ground. I found out when I read the report myself. My name was buried 3 paragraphs down, mentioned only once. I had a choice. Fight it and risk being labeled a troublemaker, or let it go for the sake of my career. I was still new. My file was thin. A black mark this early could shadow me for years. Most people in my position would have stayed quiet. I didn't. I went straight to the operations office, handed over helmet cam footage from another sailor that showed me on the ground, tourniquet in place, calling for extraction. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of lying. I simply said, "This belongs in the official record." 2 days later, the report was amended. No one apologized. Rourke avoided me in the hall for weeks, but the men who'd been there, the ones who'd seen it with their own eyes, started looking at me differently, not just as an officer, but as someone they could trust when things went bad. That trust would become the backbone of everything I built later. And it was also the moment I realized something important. The real battles weren't always against the enemy out there. Sometimes they were fought in rooms with air conditioning and polished floors against people wearing the same uniform as you. The weeks after Okinawa were a strange mix of quiet pride and hollow spaces. My days were packed. Briefings, inventory checks, endless paperwork to make sure no one in the chain could claim I'd missed a step. Outwardly, I was functioning just fine, but inside there was a weight that didn't lift. It would hit hardest during mail call. Every afternoon, the mail clerk would slide open the small metal doors on the wall of cubbies. Around me, sailors would pull out thick envelopes, padded packages, boxes wrapped in bright tape. Laughter and shouts would fill the room as people read notes from home or ripped open care packages full of cookies, socks, and silly trinkets. My box was usually empty. On the rare days something was inside, it was a single envelope with my mother's neat handwriting. She never missed a month. Sometimes she'd write about her students, sometimes she'd send a poem clipped from an old book. Storms aren't meant to stay grounded, she'd remind me. Let the wind harden you, not break you. There was never a letter from my father. Not once. It wasn't just the absence of his words. It was the knowledge that he knew exactly where I was, exactly what I was doing, and still chose silence. I told myself I didn't care, that his opinion didn't matter anymore. But the truth was messier. A part of me still wanted him to acknowledge the uniform I'd fought to wear. The irony was that my name was starting to carry weight in the unit. People I barely knew would nod when I passed. Chiefs would call me in for my take on a logistics problem before looping in others with more seniority. I was proving myself in ways that mattered. And yet, when I lay in my bunk at night, the quiet pressed in like a physical thing. The Okinawa mission had given me the trust of the people who'd seen me work. But it had also shown me how easily credit could be stolen, how quickly a truth could be rewritten if you weren't willing to fight for it. That reality followed me into every meeting, every briefing. And it wasn't just in the field. There were politics in every corner of the Navy. Alliances, grudges, unspoken debts. I'd hear my name in conversations I wasn't part of. Sometimes it was good. Carter's sharp. She sees problems before they happen. Sometimes it wasn't. Careful. She doesn't let things slide. Might make waves where you don't want them. The temptation to soften, to make myself smaller so I could blend in, was real. If you don't stand out, you don't get targeted. But I'd already made that mistake in my father's house. Keeping quiet, swallowing the words I wanted to say just to keep the peace. I wasn't going to repeat it here. Still, the cost was high. There were nights I'd stare at the ceiling of my quarters, thinking about how easy it would be to pack it in, transfer to a safer posting, one where I wouldn't have to keep proving myself over and over. I imagined the relief of walking into a room without wondering who was quietly waiting for me to slip. But then I'd remember Lang's Christmas card, Avery's tiny face, the weight of his blood on my gloves, the sound of his voice, hoarse but certain. You saved me. It reminded me why I was here. Not for the approval of people like Keating or Rourke. Not even for the recognition my father refused to give. I was here for the ones who counted on me when things went bad. For the ones who needed me to hold the line, even when it meant standing alone. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it became something I could carry, like extra weight in a rucksack. Uncomfortable, but manageable if you adjusted your stride. And in some ways, it sharpened me. Made me watch more closely. Made me listen between the lines. Because in the Navy, you learn fast. The battle you see coming is rarely the one that takes you down. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind that started quietly enough to make you suspicious. I was in the hangar bay, overseeing the loadout for a convoy that would depart within the hour. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and salt water, forklifts weaving between stacks of crates, sailors calling out weights and destinations. I had just finished checking the last manifest when Chief Petty Officer Hill walked up. "Ma'am, you've got visitors." His tone wasn't casual. I turned, and there they were, 5 of the guys I'd deployed with on Okinawa. Lang was among them, walking with a limp but upright, a cane in one hand. The others had driven hours from their current posts just to see me. They were grinning like it was Christmas morning. Lang handed me a small beat-up ammo can. "We figured you'd like this better than a plaque," he said. Inside were patches, coins, and tiny mementos from missions we'd run together. Things they'd carried, worn, or kept in their pockets for luck. "Every one of us owes you something," Lang continued, "but this is all of us saying we'd follow you anywhere." The hangar was noisy, but I swear for a moment everything went still. That kind of respect wasn't written in evaluations or pinned to your chest in a ceremony. It was earned, piece by piece, in the heat, in the dirt, in the middle of a storm when no one else could take the weight. I thanked them, and for a moment I let myself feel it. The rare, quiet warmth of knowing the people who mattered had my back. That evening, still carrying the ammo can, I went to the base communications office to call my mother. She'd want to hear about Lang walking again, about the guys showing up like that. She answered on the second ring, her voice brightening the second she realized it was me. Halfway through the call, I heard another voice in the background, my father's, low at first, then clearer when he came closer to the phone. "Tell her I heard about that mission," he said. My pulse skipped. This was it. Maybe finally he'd say something different. Then came the rest. Figures they'd lower the bar. The words landed like a punch to the ribs. My mother went quiet. I could hear him walking away. I didn't argue, didn't try to defend myself. I just said, "I have to go, Mom," and hung up. The ammo can was still on the table beside me, its weight suddenly heavier than it had been that morning. Walking back to my quarters, I thought about the two moments. Lang and the others standing in that hangar, handing me pieces of their history, and my father, miles away, reducing it all to nothing in a single sentence. It would have been easy to let his voice drown out theirs, to let the weight of his disapproval erase the respect I'd been given by those who had earned theirs the same way I had. But standing in that hallway, I made a choice. His words didn't define me anymore. The next morning, I pinned one of the patches from the ammo can inside my locker. Not where anyone else could see it, but where I'd notice it every time I grabbed my gear. A reminder that the people who mattered didn't measure me by the standards he clung to. They measured me by the way I showed up when it counted. That patch stayed there for the rest of my career. And every time I saw it, I remembered that the loudest voices aren't always the truest ones. When my orders for Coronado came through, I knew it wasn't just another posting. Coronado wasn't a place you coasted. It was the beating heart of SEAL training, the crucible where some of the toughest men in the world were pushed past their limits, where the line between breaking and becoming stronger was measured in inches. My new role was officially Operational Readiness Oversight. In plain English, it meant I had to make sure every man who left this base for deployment could perform at peak level, physically and mentally. The unspoken part? It also meant navigating the minefield of tradition. The SEAL program had a reputation, and there were plenty of people here who believed the way they'd always done things was the only way worth doing. On my first week, I shadowed the training pipeline from dawn until nightfall. I watched candidates stumble through the surf zone in full gear, faces raw from salt and wind, muscles quivering from hours of log PT. I watched injuries. Too many of them. Torn ligaments, stress fractures, hypothermia cases pulled from the water shivering and barely coherent. The dropout rate was brutal, but what struck me was how much of it was preventable. One afternoon, after a candidate collapsed from heat exhaustion during a timed ruck, I asked for the training logs. The pattern was clear. Recovery periods were being cut short, and hydration checks were inconsistent. I'd seen this before in other postings. Attrition as a point of pride. Even if it meant losing good operators to injuries that could have been avoided. I called a meeting with the senior instructors. Some listened, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Others didn't bother hiding their skepticism. "With respect, ma'am," one of them said, "you can't make SEALs by wrapping them in bubble wrap." "This isn't bubble wrap," I said evenly. "This is about making sure the ones who have what it takes actually make it through without breaking before they ever see the field." I proposed changes. Mandatory hydration checkpoints during high heat evolutions, adjusted recovery intervals, and something I knew would raise eyebrows. A peer mentorship program pairing stronger candidates with those struggling to share tips and keep morale from collapsing. The pushback was immediate. "We've been doing this for decades," another instructor said. "You start softening the edges, you get soft operators." "It's not about softening edges," I replied. "It's about sharpening the right ones." In the weeks that followed, I implemented the changes anyway. Not recklessly. I had data, case studies from other commands, medical officers backing me up. Still, the resistance was constant. Paperwork got lost, reports were submitted late, and more than once I heard muttered comments when I walked past, but the results spoke for themselves. By the end of the first training cycle under the new guidelines, the dropout rate had fallen by 12%. Injury rates were cut nearly in half. Candidates were making it through Hell Week in better condition, mentally and physically, than in years past. Not everyone was happy about it. One afternoon in the mess hall, I caught two senior instructors talking. "She's making it too easy," one said. "In a few years, we'll be sending operators into combat who can't hack it." I walked right up to their table. "Funny," I said, "because the operators who finished under this program just scored higher on every operational readiness metric than the last 3 classes combined. If that's easy, maybe you should start worrying about the old way." The room went quiet. That night, I got an email from an instructor who'd been silent in all the meetings. He didn't sign his name, but I knew who it was from the phrasing. "Ma'am, I've been here a long time." "You're not wrong. Keep going." It was a small thing, but it mattered. It told me that even in a place where tradition was armor, there were cracks. Places where new ideas could take root if you were stubborn enough to keep pushing. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. Tradition dies hard, especially in places where it's worn like a badge of honor. And I just made it clear I wasn't afraid to challenge it. That meant the next battle was already on its way. It started with a tag on social media. I was halfway through reviewing training reports when my phone buzzed. A notification from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd tagged me in a post, one that already had dozens of comments. At the top was a picture of me in uniform, taken during a change of command ceremony. Standing tall, medals on display, shaking hands with a visiting admiral. The caption wasn't mine. It was my brother Ethan's. Looks impressive, doesn't it? Shame the Navy has turned into a PR circus. Some people get promoted because they earn it, others because they make the right headlines. The word sat there like a fresh bruise. Ethan had always been my father's golden child. Oldest, most charismatic, the one who followed the acceptable path. Law school, a cushy firm in DC, a country club membership before 30. When I joined the Navy, he didn't argue with me like Dad did. He just smiled that tight little smile that said he didn't take it seriously. But now, here he was, turning my career into a talking point for his followers. The comments rolled in fast. Some from strangers who didn't know me at all. Figures. Diversity hire. Bet she's never seen a real fight. Others from family. Yes, family. Liking the post or adding little digs about how real soldiers don't need publicity. I didn't reply. Not publicly. The Navy drilled into you early that online fights only hurt you. But the silence didn't mean it didn't get under my skin. It did. A few days later, my mother called. "He's just jealous, Vanessa," she said quietly. "He can't stand that you've made it without doing it the way he did." "Then he should have said it to my face," I replied. The tension wasn't just between Ethan and me. Word spread through the family, the way it always does. At the next holiday gathering, I noticed who sat together and who didn't. My aunt, who'd always been warm to me, barely made eye contact. My uncle, one of Dad's closest friends, made a point of asking Ethan about his real job before turning to me and saying, "So, still playing Navy?" It was the same language my father used, and I didn't need to guess where it came from. But what really drove it home was the phone call from Dad himself. Short, to the point. "You've divided the family," he said, as if I'd orchestrated some plot to tear them apart. "Ethan's not wrong, you know. This media attention, it's not the same as earning respect." I let him finish. Then I said, "Dad, I didn't divide anything. People chose their side. And for the record, the respect I've earned doesn't come from a headline. It comes from the people I've led into places you've only read about." There was a pause, the kind that stretched long enough for me to know he wasn't going to answer in any way that mattered. Then the line went dead. Back in Coronado, I poured myself into the work. If I was going to be accused of chasing publicity, I'd make sure the results left no room for doubt. The training reforms I'd put in place were paying off in ways even my critics couldn't ignore. Graduates from my cycle were posting some of the highest operational readiness scores in years. Injuries were down. Retention was up. And still, the whispers from home were louder than any praise from the field. Late one night, after a particularly grueling inspection, I found an envelope slipped under my office door. No name. Inside was a single line on a torn piece of paper. "Don't let them write your story for you." I didn't know who had sent it, but I pinned it inside my locker next to the patch Lang had given me. Between the two, I had a reminder every day. One for the people who had trusted me with their lives, and one for the fact that there would always be someone trying to tell my story for me. And I decided they would fail. The invitation came in the form of a classified memo. My unit had been selected to participate in a multinational joint exercise in the Pacific. On paper, it was a chance to strengthen alliances, test interoperability, and showcase the Navy's finest. In reality, I knew these events were as much about optics as they were about operational readiness. The planning sessions began weeks in advance. Representatives from several allied nations filled the conference room, uniforms in varying shades of navy and khaki, accents mixing in the air like the scent of coffee and stale air conditioning. My role was to oversee the logistics and security protocols for the maritime phase. It was meticulous work. Coordinating convoy routes, timing air support, ensuring that every vessel had the right supplies at the right time. Everything was on track until I noticed something off in the final operational draft. The convoy route for one of our allied fleets cut dangerously close to a disputed maritime boundary. On the map, it was a neat line. In reality, it was a powder keg. One wrong move, and we could find ourselves in the middle of an international incident. The plan had been approved and signed off by Rear Admiral Thomas Keane, the senior officer in charge of the exercise. Keane was respected, but also known for his pride. Questioning his plan in front of allies would embarrass him, a political misstep that could cost me more than my reputation. I weighed my options. If I kept silent and nothing happened, the exercise would go smoothly and no one would be the wiser. But if a foreign patrol decided to challenge our presence, we could be facing an armed standoff in the middle of a so-called training operation. I requested a private meeting with Keane. He didn't bother hiding his irritation when I laid the map on his desk. "Carter, this plan has been through multiple reviews," he said, his voice clipped. "We're not here to reinvent the wheel." "With respect, sir," I replied, "the wheel is about to roll straight into a minefield. This boundary isn't just a line on a chart. It's contested, and recent intel suggests increased patrols in the area. If they intercept, the exercise could turn into a real-world escalation." Keane leaned back, folding his arms. "We can't change it now without sending the message that we lack confidence. Optics matter." "So does avoiding an international incident," I said, holding his gaze. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "You make your adjustments, Carter, but you take full responsibility if this blows back politically." I accepted without hesitation. That night, I worked with my team to redraw the route, adding a buffer that kept us well clear of the disputed waters. We briefed the Allied commanders at dawn, framing it as a move to maximize operational flexibility. No one argued. 2 days into the exercise, our intel picked up chatter from a patrol force moving toward the exact area we'd avoided. The next morning, the report came in. They had intercepted a civilian research vessel, accusing it of crossing into restricted territory. Had we followed the original route, it would have been one of ours. Keane never said thank you. In fact, he avoided mentioning the change at all during the closing brief. But as the ships pulled into port at the end of the exercise, one of the Allied captains sought me out. "You saved us a diplomatic nightmare," he said quietly. "I'll remember that." In the Navy, not every victory comes with applause. Some are just quiet acknowledgments passed in corridors, the kind that never make it into the official record. But I knew what we'd prevented. And I knew that in protecting the mission, I'd also put a target on my back. Because if there's one thing more dangerous than making a mistake in this line of work, it's proving someone else made one. The promotion orders arrived in a plain manila envelope, no different from the countless others that had crossed my desk. but inside was a line that changed the trajectory of my career. Effective immediately, Captain Vanessa Carter is promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral, lower half. It wasn't just a new title. It meant I was now the youngest admiral in my command's history. Years of deployments, sleepless nights, decisions that weighed lives in their balance. All of it had led here. The ceremony was scheduled for the following Friday on the deck of the USS Independence. The Pacific was calm that morning, sunlight flashing across the water like scattered coins. Officers in full dress lined the rails, their ribbons catching the light. Friends, colleagues, and even a few former commanding officers stood in the crowd. I spotted Lang near the front, cane in hand, giving me a small nod. When my name was called, I stepped forward. The Admiral, placing the star on my shoulder, spoke about leadership under pressure, about refusing to compromise on integrity. I stood at attention, the sea breeze lifting the edges of my white combination cover, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel proud without reservation. After the ceremony, I ducked away to the communications room to call my mother. She answered on the first ring. "I saw the photos already," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Vanessa, I'm so proud of you." Before I could reply, I heard a shuffle and then my father's voice, sharp and uninvited. "Proud? For what? They're just making you a poster girl." It was the same tone he'd used my entire life. Flat, dismissive, absolute. The sting was still there, even after all these years. I could have argued. I could have listed every operation, every risk, every life I'd fought to protect. But I knew it wouldn't matter. His mind was a fortress I'd stopped trying to storm long ago. "I earned this," I said simply, "whether you see it or not." There was a pause. Then the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the hum of the ship's systems filling the silence. Outside, the celebration was still going. Laughter, handshakes, camera shutters clicking. Inside, I felt the same familiar split. The weight of his disapproval pressing from one side, the solid anchor of my own conviction holding on the other. When I stepped back onto the deck, Lang intercepted me. He held out a small box. Inside was a coin, navy blue enamel with a silver trident in the center. The words, "Earned, not given," etched around the edge. "From the guys," he said. "We figured you'd understand." I closed the box and slipped it into my pocket. The star on my shoulder was official recognition, but the coin, that was the one that mattered. That night, as the ship cut through the Pacific under a sky full of stars, I stood at the rail, the wind tugging at my jacket. I thought about the girl who'd been told she'd never wear the uniform, who'd been handed an envelope full of respectable careers, who'd been told her achievements were the result of lowered standards. And I thought about the woman standing here now, not because someone had opened the door for her, but because she'd kicked it open herself. The ocean stretched out in every direction, endless and unbroken. Somewhere out there was the next challenge, the next fight. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking for my father's approval on the horizon. I was looking for the next place to plant my flag. Mark Donovan wasn't intimidated by uniforms. He'd worn one himself for over a decade, serving in the Marine Corps with a record that could quiet a room. We met during a joint naval exercise off Guam. He was part of the security detail for a visiting delegation. I was overseeing the fleet supply lines. Our first conversation was about maps and tide charts, but I remember the way he listened, really listened when I spoke. 3 years later, he was down on one knee in the courtyard of the Naval Academy, the same place I had once walked as a plebe with too many doubts and too few allies. The yes came easily. What followed, however, was anything but. Mark's family lived in Charleston, old Southern stock with deep military ties. His father had been a Marine colonel, his grandfather a Navy aviator. They were polite when we visited, but there was a stiffness to the way his mother said my name, as if it were a title she wasn't sure how to address. I noticed the glances they exchanged when the conversation turned to my career, how many ships I'd commanded, the star on my shoulder, the deployments. It came to a head one evening at dinner. Mark's older sister, Caroline, was swirling her wine when she said, "You must be very busy, Vanessa. I wonder how you'll balance that with, well, marriage." I set my fork down. The same way I've balanced deployments and commands, with planning, communication, and respect. Her smile was thin. Of course, it's just, Mark isn't used to being in someone's shadow. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak right away. I could feel the weight of his parents' eyes on him. Finally, he said, "Caroline, Vanessa doesn't cast a shadow. She carries her own light, and I'm not afraid to stand in it." The table went quiet after that, but the tension didn't fade. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the undercurrents became harder to ignore. Mark would come home from calls with his mother, his shoulders tense. One night, he admitted, they think the wedding's going to turn into a Navy spectacle. They're worried people will talk about your career more than us. It stung, but it wasn't new. "Mark," I said, "people have been talking about my career more than my personal life for years. It doesn't make this wedding any less ours." He nodded, but I could tell it weighed on him. There were moments when the strain showed between us. Small arguments about seating charts would spiral into bigger questions. Who should be in the front row? How many uniforms should be allowed in the bridal party? At one point, Mark suggested a smaller, private ceremony to keep things simple. I knew what he meant, to keep the politics and the optics at bay. But I also knew this wedding was more than just a ceremony for me. It was a milestone I'd reached despite every voice that told me I couldn't. And I wasn't going to hide it. We found a fragile truce by agreeing to keep the guest list balanced. Military colleagues on my side, old friends and extended family on his. But the undercurrent remained, an unspoken question hanging between us. Could we walk into that chapel as equals, or would the weight of my rank tilt the balance before we ever said, "I do"? The night before we left for the wedding venue, Mark caught me staring at my dress blues, laid out on the bed. "You're thinking about wearing them, aren't you?" he asked. I hesitated. "It's who I am, Mark. I fought too hard to stand in that chapel pretending I'm not Admiral Carter." He came over, took my hands. "Then wear them. And let's make sure everyone in that room knows I married you for every reason they think I shouldn't have." It was the kind of thing only Mark could say without it sounding like a challenge. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were back on the same side of the fight. If there was any part of me still holding on to the hope that my father might show up for the wedding, it dissolved the week before the ceremony. It started with another phone call from my mother. Her voice was careful, the way people sound when they're walking across ice they know is too thin. "Vanessa," she said, "your father, he doesn't plan to attend." I didn't speak at first. "Did he say why?" "He said—" She paused, and I could almost hear her deciding whether to spare me the exact words. But my mother had never been one to lie to me. "He said, that's not a wedding. It's a PR stunt." I exhaled slowly. It wasn't that I hadn't expected it. I just hadn't expected it to land quite so sharply. Then she added, "Your brother's been vocal, too. He posted something online again. It's getting attention." I didn't need to ask what kind of attention. I opened my laptop, and there it was. A photo of me in my dress blues, taken during an awards ceremony months ago. Ethan's caption read, "When a wedding becomes another mission briefing." The comments were worse. Strangers calling me a narcissist, old acquaintances from high school joining in with snide remarks. Even a few extended relatives adding laughing emojis as if this was all a joke. I closed the laptop. "Mom, I need you to promise me something," I said. "If you feel like this is too much, if it's too hard to stand there with all this noise, you don't have to come." Her voice softened. "Vanessa, I will be there. Front row, no matter what your father or your brother say." Still, the undercurrent of division was impossible to ignore. Word reached me through cousins and mutual friends that a few relatives on my father's side were planning to boycott the wedding in solidarity with him. Others weren't sure if they should come, afraid of being caught in the middle. The idea that my wedding day, a day meant to be about love and commitment, had turned into a battlefield of loyalty tests made my stomach turn. Mark noticed. One night, after I'd been silent through most of dinner, he set down his fork. "Talk to me," he said. I told him everything. The boycott, the posts, the comments. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Vanessa, these people aren't objecting to the wedding. They're objecting to who you are. And that's not something you can or should change." It should have been comforting, but there was still a part of me, that little girl who once showed her father a model ship, that wished just one thing could be different. 2 days before the wedding, a courier arrived at the venue with a package for me. Inside was a small wooden box. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was from my father. But there was no note, just a worn-out brass compass. I recognized it instantly. It had belonged to my grandfather, a Navy aviator. I asked my mother about it later that night. "Your grandfather left it to your father," she said. "He told me once he'd pass it to you when you earned it." I guess he decided that day never came. It wasn't hard to guess what had happened. He must have told Ethan to send it, perhaps as some twisted statement that he was done holding on to it. I sat with the compass in my palm for a long time, feeling the grooves worn by years of use. It could have been a symbol of connection, a bridge across decades of service in our family. Instead, it felt like a farewell I hadn't asked for. Still, I put it in my bag. Not as a blessing from my father, but as a reminder of what I'd built without him. By the time the rehearsal dinner came, I had stopped looking at the door, half expecting him to walk through it. My family wasn't going to be whole that day. But the people who stood by me, my mother, my crew, my closest friends, would be enough. Or at least that's what I told myself. The Naval Chapel at the base was a place I'd walked into 100 times before. But this time was different. The moment the venue was announced publicly, it stopped being just a wedding. It became an event. Within days, the guest list had become a balancing act between personal and professional. Alongside Mark's family and my closest friends were admirals, senior officers, and even a few foreign naval attachés. Some had served with me in dangerous waters. Others were there because attendance was a matter of diplomatic courtesy. And with them came something I'd been trying to avoid: media interest. A week before the ceremony, a major defense news outlet published an article titled, "Admiral Carter to wed former Marine in a high-profile ceremony at Naval Chapel." The piece speculated about the guest list, hinted at political implications, and even quoted an unnamed source suggesting the wedding would be as much about optics as it is about vows. That same day, I got a message from an old mentor, Admiral Sinclair. He'd served as Chief of Naval Operations before retiring, and he never wasted words. "Be careful," he wrote. "Every camera in that room will be looking for a story. Decide now what story you want to tell." His warning wasn't without cause. I'd already received subtle reminders from public affairs officers to stay on message during any informal remarks. One even suggested I consider wearing a different uniform, something less imposing than full-dress blues, to keep the tone personal. It was hard not to see the irony. The same career they'd once said I wasn't suited for was now being treated like an image they had to manage. Even inside the Navy, there were murmurs. At a pre-wedding security briefing, one captain pulled me aside. "Off the record, Admiral. Some folks are saying this is going to be used to push certain narratives, that your visibility makes it a perfect stage." I looked him in the eye. "If people want to turn my wedding into a political prop, they're going to be disappointed. This is about me and Mark." But I knew it wasn't that simple. The day before the ceremony, I walked through the chapel with the event coordinator. Rows of seats stretched back from the altar, the front reserved for family and distinguished guests. A small army of security personnel was already running through their protocols. As we moved down the aisle, I caught sight of the name placards in the front row. Mark's parents, my mother, Lang, Admiral Sinclair. The seat with my father's name was missing. It had never been printed. That night, Mark found me sitting alone in the empty chapel. The light from the stained glass windows cast patterns across the pews, and for a moment the place felt more like a command post before a mission than a wedding venue. "They're going to talk, you know," he said gently. "They're going to write whatever story they want. But the only people who matter are the ones standing here when it happens." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that when the doors opened and I walked down that aisle, I could shut out the noise. But years in uniform had taught me that perception often carried more weight than truth. And this time, the battlefield wasn't on the water or in a war zone. It was right here, between the vows, the uniforms, and the camera lenses waiting to frame every moment. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, the kind of day sailors pray for when they're heading out to sea. I woke before the alarm, the steady hum of the bass already filtering through the open window. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint clang of a ship's bell. In the dressing room of the chapel, my dress blues hung against the far wall, pressed and perfect. I'd chosen them over a traditional gown without hesitation. They weren't just a uniform. They were the sum of every fight I'd fought to stand here today. When it was time, I stepped into the hallway, my cover tucked under my arm, the medals on my chest catching the morning light. The murmurs from the chapel quieted as I reached the doors. The organ began to play. As the double doors swung open, I took in the room in one sweep. Rows of faces, friends, colleagues, commanders, turned toward me. Mark was at the altar, his back straight, his smile steady. My mother sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, pride written plain on her face. And then I saw it. The empty seat where my father should have been. For a moment, the absence was a weight on my chest. But before the thought could settle, a figure in the second row stood. It was General Marcus Harlow, a 4-star with a presence that could stop a room cold. He turned toward the rest of the chapel, his voice carrying over the music. "Admiral Carter," he called. "Front row." There was a ripple of movement as those in the aisle stepped back to let him pass. He walked to the empty seat in the front, turned it slightly toward the aisle, and sat down, his posture sharp, his gaze forward. The message was unmistakable. The seat meant for my father would not remain a void. The weight in my chest shifted, not gone, but replaced by something steadier. As I walked down the aisle, I caught the small nod Harlow gave me. A sailor's acknowledgement, brief but absolute. The rest of the ceremony unfolded in a blur of words and vows, but that moment stayed anchored in my mind. It wasn't about replacing my father. It was about the truth I'd carried my whole career. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And in that room, among those who had served and sacrificed, I had earned my place. When Mark and I turned to face the guests as husband and wife, I saw Lang in the pew behind my mother, his hand raised in a subtle salute. Others followed. Men and women from different ships, different tours, all offering the same quiet tribute. Outside, the photographers waited, lenses ready, flashes popping. I knew the headlines would come. About the uniforms, the guest list, the political implications. But they wouldn't tell the whole story. The real story was in the way my mother squeezed my hand as we stepped out into the sunlight. In the way Mark leaned close and whispered, "Told you we'd stand in your light together." In the way General Harlow had made sure the empty space in the front row wasn't a symbol of absence, but of recognition. That night, long after the reception ended and the last guests had gone, I sat alone on the chapel steps, the Pacific air cool against my face. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the old brass compass my father had sent. Unwanted, unblessed. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the grooves. Then I took out the challenge coin Lang had given me, the one etched with earned, not given. I set them side by side on the step. One was a relic of expectations I'd never meet. The other was proof of a life I'd built on my own terms. I left the compass on the step. The coin went back in my pocket. When I stood, the horizon was dark except for the faint glow of ships at anchor. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull of someone else's approval in the distance. The only direction that mattered was forward. The Monday after the wedding, my inbox was already a battlefield. Mark and I had barely unpacked from the reception when my aide called to say there was a sealed dispatch waiting for me at HQ. I drove in, still wearing my hair loose from the weekend, the scent of salt water from our brief stop at the beach lingering in my jacket. Inside the envelope was a formal letter from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. It was short, almost too short for what it meant. "You are hereby considered for appointment to the position of Deputy Director for Strategic Maritime Policy at the Pentagon." I read it twice, letting the words settle. It was one of the most prestigious postings in the Navy. A desk at the very heart of military decision-making. It also meant leaving the fleet. For years, my life had been defined by the hum of the engine room, the spray of seawater on my face, the feel of a ship's deck rolling under my boots. Out there, the stakes were immediate, tangible. Out there, I knew exactly who I was. The Pentagon was different. It was meetings in windowless rooms, policy drafts, strategy papers that might shape the Navy's future but would never see the light of day beyond classified briefings. It was influence, yes, but from a distance. That night, I told Mark over dinner. "It's the kind of job people spend their careers chasing," I said. "I'd be helping shape naval policy at the highest level." Mark looked at me for a long moment. "And you'd be giving up the sea?" I didn't answer right away. "I'd still serve." "Yes," he said carefully, "but would you still be you?" The question landed heavier than I expected. Over the next week, I spoke with mentors, officers I trusted. Admiral Sinclair called it a rare opportunity to make an impact where it counts. My former XO reminded me that careers don't last forever at sea, and that I'd earned the right to choose my next chapter. But there was another voice in my head, quieter but persistent. It was the same one that had pushed me to run toward gunfire in Okinawa, the one that had fought to rewrite a false report, the one that had stood in front of instructors at Coronado and said change was necessary. That voice didn't want to trade the chaos and clarity of command for a desk in DC. On the fourth night, I found myself in the base gym long after it had closed, just walking the empty basketball court. The echo of my boots reminded me of pacing the deck during night watches. Out there, I'd felt the ocean under me, the responsibility ahead of me. And I realized something important. I wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. When I called the CNO's office the next morning, my answer was clear. "I'm honored," I said, "but my place is still with the fleet. At least for now." The officer on the other end didn't argue. He just said, "Understood, Admiral. We'll keep you on the short list for future consideration." When I told Mark, he smiled, not in relief, but in recognition. "That's the woman I married," he said. I knew it wouldn't be the last time I'd face this choice. The Navy had a way of circling back with the same questions until you gave a different answer. But for now, I was still where I belonged. Out on the water, where every decision had weight, and every horizon was mine to meet head-on. It was 2 weeks after the wedding when I first heard the rumor. I was in my office going through after-action reports from a recent readiness drill when Lang stuck his head in. "You know your dad?" he said, in that cautious way people do when they're about to drop something you might not like. Word is, a few of his old buddies have been asking why he skipped the wedding. One of them, an old Navy captain, apparently gave him hell for it. I didn't react at first. My father had been part of a tight-knit circle of retired officers for decades. They met for coffee, played golf, swapped stories from their days at sea. If they'd started questioning him, it meant the story of General Harlow standing in his place had traveled further than I thought. A few days later, my mother called. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Your father's been quiet," she said. "He's not saying much, but I can tell something's on his mind." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," she said gently, "that for the first time in a long time, he's not so sure he's right." I didn't know what to do with that. For years, I'd trained myself not to expect anything from him. Not acknowledgement, not apology, not even a conversation that didn't feel like a sparring match. Now there was a crack in the wall, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to look through it. Then, one Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Vanessa. His voice was the same as always, steady, clipped, giving nothing away. I heard about the front row thing with Harlow. I waited. "He served under me once," my father continued. "He doesn't give up his seat for just anyone." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even praise. But it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd heard from him in years. "Yeah," I said. "I know." There was a pause, the kind that usually came before he ended the call. But this time, he surprised me. "I'll be at the change of command next month, if you want me there." I didn't say yes right away. Part of me wanted to make him feel the distance he'd created. But another part, the one that had stood in the chapel and felt the empty space beside my mother, knew that if there was any chance to bridge it, I had to take it. "I want you there," I said. When the day came, he showed up early, dressed in a dark suit, polished shoes, standing ramrod straight in the back of the hangar as the crew assembled. He didn't approach me before the ceremony, didn't try to make a scene. But when my name was called and the crowd applauded, I saw him in the front row next to my mother, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on me. Afterward, as the crowd began to thin, he walked over. "Good ceremony," he said. Then, almost reluctantly, "You run a tight ship." It was simple, short. But in my family, sometimes 2 sentences could carry the weight of an entire chapter. I didn't expect us to suddenly become close. But I knew this. For the first time in years, my father had taken a step toward me. And maybe, just maybe, that meant the distance wasn't permanent. Mark and I had barely settled into the rhythm of our short honeymoon when the call came. We'd chosen a quiet coastal town a few hours' drive from the base, a rented cottage overlooking a stretch of empty beach, The kind of place where the loudest sound at night was the surf against the rocks. It had been 2 days of nothing but long walks, cooking together, and sleeping without alarms. Then my secure phone rang. It was 0430. Admiral Carter, we have a situation, the voice on the other end said. It was Commander Reyes, my operations chief. Unscheduled activity in the disputed waters off the archipelago. Intel suggests possible interception of a U.S.-flagged research vessel. We've been tasked with deploying a response team immediately. Fleet Command is requesting your direct oversight. I sat up in bed, my pulse already shifting into operational tempo. Understood. Wheels up in an hour. Mark stirred beside me, already awake, his eyes on my face. He didn't need to ask what was happening. By the time I ended the call, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on a t-shirt. How long? He asked. Could be days, maybe more. He nodded, but I saw the shadow in his eyes. I know what I signed up for, Vanessa, but it's our first week. I know. I reached for his hand. And I wouldn't leave if it wasn't important. But you also know what it means when I get that call. He gave a small, tired smile. Yeah, it means the ocean comes first. The words weren't meant as a jab, but they still landed with weight. 30 minutes later, I was in full uniform, duffel packed, boots laced tight. Mark drove me to the airfield in silence. As we pulled up to the tarmac, he turned to me. Go do your job, but when you get back, we finish this week, no matter what. Deal, I said. The mission unfolded with the kind of intensity that leaves no room for personal thoughts. We made contact with the research vessel just as a pair of patrol boats from the opposing side began shadowing it. Through careful maneuvering, radio coordination, and the presence of 2 destroyers on our flank, we de-escalated without a single shot fired. 48 hours after I'd left the cottage, I was on a return flight. My body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind wired from the adrenaline. Mark was waiting at the gate when I landed. No uniform, no ceremony. Just him in jeans and a hoodie, hands in his pockets. I half expected a joke, maybe even a jab about our interrupted honeymoon. Instead, he just said, "Let's go home." Back at the cottage, he poured us each a drink and sat across from me at the small kitchen table. I'll never get used to it, he admitted. Not the leaving, I understand that, but the way it happens. 1 minute you're here, the next you're halfway across the ocean. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. It's not easy for me either, but it's the life we chose, both of us. He nodded slowly. Yeah, and I'm still choosing it. That was the thing about marriage to someone in uniform. Love wasn't just a feeling. It was a decision you had to make over and over again, especially when the world kept testing it. 3 days after we returned from the mission, a plain brown envelope arrived at my office. No return address, no markings except my name handwritten across the front in block letters I knew better than my own. I didn't open it right away. It sat on the corner of my desk while I finished paperwork, while I took calls, while the bass loudspeakers cycled through the midday announcements. Finally, when the office was quiet, I slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, torn from a notebook. The handwriting was my father's. Neat, deliberate, the way he wrote everything from grocery lists to performance evaluations. It said only, "Vanessa, I was wrong. Keep your course. No signature, no date." For a long moment, I just sat there, the paper resting in my hands. It wasn't an apology for all the years of doubt or the things he'd said before the wedding. It wasn't a confession of regret, but it was something I'd never expected to see. Admission, however brief, that the compass I'd been steering by all these years was the right one. I folded the letter and slipped it into my breast pocket. Then I walked out to the pier. The late afternoon sun was low, turning the water gold. Ships rocked gently against their moorings, their hull numbers catching the light. I stood at the edge, feeling the wind off the Pacific, and thought about how far I'd come from the girl who once stood in her father's study, holding a model ship and wondering if she'd ever be allowed to set sail. Now, there was no permission to seek. Mark joined me a few minutes later, hands in his jacket pockets. "Another mission?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, patting the pocket where the letter rested. "Just a different kind of message." He didn't press. Instead, he stood beside me, looking out at the water. We stayed like that for a while, the quiet between us steady and sure. When the first stars began to appear, I took the brass compass, still in my desk since the day he'd sent it, and the challenge coin Lang had given me. I held them both in my palm. This one, I said, showing Mark the coin, is what I've earned. Then I held up the compass. This one, I think I finally earned too, just not in the way he imagined. Mark smiled faintly. So what happens now? Now, I said, watching the horizon. We keep our course. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of open water. Somewhere out there I knew was the next mission, the next challenge. And when it came, I'd be ready. Not because I needed to prove anything anymore, but because this was the life I had chosen. And for the first time in a long while, I knew my father finally understood that. I took one last look at the horizon before turning back toward the pier, the letter still warm in my pocket. Some journeys take you across oceans. Others just take you back to the place you've always belonged. If this story has meant something to you, if it's reminded you that respect is earned, not given, then I hope you'll stay with me for the next chapter. You're watching Hidden Family Revenge Stories, and here, every story is a voyage worth taking. Go ahead and click that like button, subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a single journey we share. The sea is wide, the stories are endless, and I'll be here to tell them, one voyage at a time.